I'm Kevin O'Neill. I'm a pulmonary critical care and sleep physician in Wilmington, North Carolina, in private practice, group practice called Wilmington Health.
I'm Catherine Bolello. I'm a program director for a pulmonary critical care fellowship in Fresno, California called UCSF Fresno. We're affiliated with UC San Francisco. Um, and I teach fellows and see patients.
Hi, I'm Susan Murin. I'm at University of California, Davis. I've been a practicing pulmonary critical care physician here for over 27 years, but for the last year have been in the role of interim dean of the School of Medicine. My family had a history of military service. Actually, both of my parents met when they were in the Air Force. I think my mother was 18 and my father 19 when they met, and they were left military service shortly thereafter. So I wasn't raised as a military brat, but I knew about that background. And when I went to medical school, quite frankly, for me, it was an economic decision, but one to which I was very open, given, again, my family's history with the Air Force. So I applied for and received an Air Force scholarship, which had the military paying my way through medical school in return for a period of active duty as payback for that commitment.
Yeah, I think my story is pretty similar. I went to medical school in Philadelphia and was one of 6 kids. And Philadelphia, the private schools in Philadelphia at the time were some of the most expensive in the country. I think only DC was more expensive. So it was started as an economic decision, but I ended up applying for a Navy scholarship, in large part because almost all of my family on both sides were Marines. So, I had at least a soft spot for the Navy, and I actually stayed in for 4 years of reserve and then 20 years, a little bit over 20 years of active service.
I did not know about these medical school scholarships until I was in college, and I went to UC Davis undergrad, and we had this amazing med school counselor, and she introduced me to these, and I didn't have any issue with having a military scholarship. And what it allowed me to do was leave California and go to NYU. I got into UCLA, which would have been affordable at the time, but I had such a magical visit to New York City over Christmas that I was like, hey, Air Force sounds good to me. And so I chose NYU and entered the Air Force Reserves.
So I will say, while I didn't train in the military, I did 100% of my training as a civilian and then entered active duty when fully trained. And I served as a pulmonary intensivist in the Air Force. But I served at an Air Force teaching hospital that had a residency program. So I was fortunate to work with those internal medicine residents throughout my period of active duty service. And I thought their training was phenomenal. Part of that, frankly, was that the economic imperatives are different. All the staff physicians are salaried, so that huge incentive to productivity that we see in many other settings wasn't as severe. And the other difference was that, of course, faculty can be ordered to do things in ways that they're not in the civilian sector. So all of our faculty were expected to attend morning report, for example. So we had 100% of our internal medicine faculty at morning report. We had 100% attendance at key teaching conferences. It was an expectation, and expectations could be enforced in the military in ways they are not in the civilian sector. And I think that resulted in a wonderful training experience for the residents there.
I did my fellowship at Walter Reed Army Medical Center, which, at the time was the Army's flagship training program, and it was just extraordinary, amazing people that I worked with. Some super smart people who are in leadership positions in different pulm critical care organizations. The patients are very compliant. I mean, you're taking care of active duty troops and their dependents as well as retirees. So everybody is compliant. That made it easy to just sort of concentrate on medical care. Another difference is that your mentors are all fairly young, because a lot of people do retire once their time is up, and so that gives you the opportunity to be a leader at a very young age. For example, during my time at Walter Reed, I was the critical care program director.
All of the program had a 100% pass rate for as long as I can remember on the national boards. The training was excellent. We had dedicated staff that really went above and beyond. And I think the practice was a little bit different in that, as Catherine mentioned, you really didn't have to worry about the economics. If somebody needed a drug, you didn't have to worry that that they were going to be non-compliant because of inability to pay, because everybody was covered for those medications. And you also, I think, just you saw some different things too, and you had a little bit different perspective, because you had people that you needed to address issues related to deployments or their active duty jobs, and you had to be aware of what their military responsibilities were, whether they were going to deploy, whether they could do their job safely in kind of areas where they may not have very much in the way of medical support, and they can't just come back to see you in 2 weeks because they may be in the middle of the desert someplace.
And I think one thing Catherine mentioned that I think many people may not realize is that when you are a military physician, you're not just caring for a relatively young, healthy population of active duty military. We also provide care to retirees and dependents. So you do see a broad spectrum of disease.
One of the neat things about being at Walter Reed also is, we took care of military VIPs. So people from Congress, retired congressmen, retired high-ranking generals and admirals, and that was kind of fun too.
I think I retired before some of the burn pit issues came up with with constrictive bronchiolitis, but that's certainly something that I think probably was not something that a lot of people saw in the civilian community. From the Navy side, a lot of undersea medicine, diving, aviation related issues that where people you're evaluating somebody for whether they were fit to be a Navy diver, and you might have somebody that was doing compression diving at very, very, very deep depths in aviation, where there's a lot of limitations on what people can and can't do. So I think those are the kind of the big areas. But even common things like sleep apnea. If you have somebody that has sleep apnea and they're deploying in a tent someplace that doesn't have power, that's a thing you don't think about, but it ended up, at least when I was on active duty, being a huge issue for a lot of people. So common things that require kind of things like electricity sometimes could be a challenge.
What we saw among our active duty were the types of pulmonary illnesses that you normally see in a young, relatively healthy population. Asthma, for example. But again, we did care for retirees and dependents, which expanded the universe of diseases that we saw. So COPD and lung cancer in our retirees. So not that dissimilar to the patient populations that I've seen since leaving the military. Also saw a lot of TB because our troops deploy around the world, often have spouses from countries where TB has a higher prevalence than it does in the U.S. So I got most of my experience in treating TB when I was active duty military, more so than I do now.
Saw a whole lot of lung cancer. I mean, for a long time, smoking's been very, very popular in the military. Not so much anymore, but lots and lots of lung cancer. Felt very, very, very comfortable with bronchoscopies and biopsies by the time I was done with training. Also saw a fair amount of malignant mesothelioma, which I haven't seen much of in California, and again related a lot to the asbestos exposure, predominantly in the retired naval population. Mostly like cystic fibrosis. I had very, very minimal exposure to cystic fibrosis, and not a whole lot of exposure to lung transplant, pulmonary hypertension, things like that. But overall, felt like I got a very good exposure to everything relevant in pulmonary and critical care medicine. Lots of HIV, lots of, during the time. So lots of experience with that medicine. Lots of infectious diseases. That's one of the things that's really interesting, I think, about the military, where you have global deployment. You see lots of interesting infectious diseases too. Absolutely. I mean, when you look at the debt that med school graduates are graduating with, it's extraordinary, and it influences, their future career pathways and such. And no, it's a fantastic way to go through medical school, and then get excellent training subsequently, and not have any debt whatsoever when you're ready to practice. And I felt my training was in no way compromised by doing it through the military.
I'll give a somewhat more nuanced, I guess, response. I would say that my experience was outstanding, and I would do it all over again. That being said, I also recognize that I was very fortunate in that I was able to complete all my training in the civilian sector, which I wanted to do. And when they moved me, which they move you where they want to, they moved me to California, right? So I'm very thrilled with the experience that I had. I think that no matter what, I think people are going to end up with good training, but people have to be aware of the fact that they may be sent to practice somewhere they would not have chosen to live. That if they wish to train as a civilian, that is only done if approved by the military. They have first dibs on your training. And there, of course, we're active duty military. There is always a concern or an expectation that you may be deployed to a foreign theater. And ultimately, I loved my practice in the military. And it was a wonderful thing for me to do for a few years after completing my fellowship, where I got to practice sort of independently without fellows and really solidify my practice style and my procedural skills before returning to academia, where I had to give my procedures away, if you will, to fellows. I don't know anybody who's unhappy with the training they received in the military. And my personal experience was fantastic, but there's no guarantee that someone else's experience would look like mine.
So Susan brings up a good point. I had actually applied for a fellowship in the private sector, and got a fellowship at a very, very nice institution, and had to petition to keep it, and was told, no, you can't. And so rather than starting fellowship, I had to do 1 year as an internist at a nice place in Virginia. And then I did my fellowship at Walter Reed. So there obviously, I was profoundly disappointed at the time, but then, you get beyond it, and then you realize the strengths that, you can experience in a different program. That's true. And then my husband at the time was deployed to Desert Storm. And we didn't have children at the time, so it wasn't, I missed him a lot, but other than that, it wasn't too much of a hardship. But those are excellent points that Susan raises. Ultimately, you don't control your destiny.
I think my concern about some of our advice is that we all trained a fairly long time ago. I mean, in my case, I hate to say it, but I mean, I've been out of training for 30 plus years at this point in time. There's been a lot of consolidation in military medicine and a lot of shrinkage. And I think like a lot of the civilian places, a lot more focus on productivity than there used to be. And so I think you have to look at the programs and look at where you're going to end up, and also make some decisions about what your career path is going to be. Because if you want to be a bench researcher or bench scientist, and you're looking for NIH grants, I don't think that most people, there are a few exceptions, most people that go into military medicine don't end up with an easy path to get to that kind of a career. if you're interested in kind of clinical practice or teaching, you can do a lot, or leadership, as I think Catherine mentioned, you can do that at a very young age and get a lot of experience that you probably would never get in a civilian training program or in a civilian hospital, just because of turnover and the fact that people get promoted up based on competency at a much faster rate than they would in the civilian side.
I'm so glad you brought that up, Kevin, because I just had a conversation with someone new to our organization today who told me, having reviewed my bio, he was struck by how early I entered leadership positions. And I pointed out to him that I directly attributed that to my period of active duty military service, where you are placed in positions of leadership far sooner than you would be in the civilian sector because of the factors my colleagues have mentioned. And not only that, but they have well-established, proven methods in leadership training, and they do train you to be a leader. And I feel that that has really influenced the entirety of my career, is that leadership training and experience that I received.